How long? Venthara asked. 42 kilometers, give or take. He said it the way you might mention that you'd walk to the corner shop. Casually, conversationally, as though it were a fact without particular weight. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture and temperature. Somewhere above us, an air recycler hummed its constant, oblivious song. A cooling system clicked on and off in the wall. Venthara's dorsal spines went completely, utterly flat, a state I had learned, in my brief time serving under her, meant she had either achieved a state of transcendent calm or was moments away from a fundamental psychological reorganization. You run 42 kilometers, she said at last, each word placed with surgical precision, voluntarily, for recreation. Oh, that's nothing, really. Marcus's expression remained entirely pleasant. Some people do ultramarathons. My friend Jenny finished a 200-kilometer race last year. Took her about 30 hours straight, but she made it. She's working up to 300 now. I checked my translator implant with a subtle tap behind my ear, deeply convinced it had suffered some catastrophic malfunction. The diagnostic came back clean. He had genuinely said 30 hours of continuous locomotion, undertaken for the explicit purpose of personal enjoyment. Venthara said nothing. She turned to her workstation with the deliberate, slightly mechanical movements of someone operating on the narrow edge between professional composure and complete astonishment. Her manipulators moved across multiple screens simultaneously, pulling files, cross-referencing data, building a picture that seemed to be assembling itself into something none of us were quite prepared to see. If you could wait here just a moment longer, Mr. Webb, I need to consult with my colleagues regarding a few results. Nothing alarming. Standard procedure for new arrivals. You're being wonderfully patient. Of course. Take your time. Document. He pulled out his personal device and settled back on the platform, the picture of relaxed compliance. Venthara's hand closed around my shoulder with enough force to activate my pain receptors, and she hauled me out into the corridor with the efficiency of someone who had made decisions under pressure for 200 years. The door sealed behind us with a soft, pneumatic hiss that sounded, to my ears, uncomfortably like a trap springing shut. "Call Commander Plex," she said, voice pitched so low it was almost a vibration rather than a sound. "Right now. Tell him we have a Category 5 biological anomaly, and that I need his immediate presence. Then pull every file we have on human physiology, evolutionary history, and behavioral psychology. Every single one." "Wrong how?" I asked. "The results are unusual, but surely." Assistant Krell. Her primary eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my exoskeleton feel 3 sizes too small. In 2 centuries of xenobiological research, I have examined specimens from over 4,000 catalog species. I have studied parasites that hijack and rewrite host neural architecture. I have cataloged predators that can achieve perfect camouflage as inanimate geological formations. I once spent 3 years documenting a species that achieves biological reproduction through quantum entanglement, and I understood, ultimately, what they were. She paused, her breathing apparatus flaring. "I cannot tell you what that is." I waited. The endurance physiology of a persistence predator. The pattern recognition architecture of an ambush hunter. The tightly coordinated social cooperation of a pack species. The adaptive tool use intelligence we associate almost exclusively with scavenger species. The hyperactive threat assessment neurology characteristic of prey animals. She pressed a manipulator flat against the corridor wall as though steadying herself against a sudden gravitational shift. And layered over all of that, a complete psychological profile that presents as warm, cooperative, curious, and non-threatening. A predator that doesn't act like one. Prey that doesn't think like one. Something that is, simultaneously, both and neither. Through the observation window behind us, I could see Marcus Webb sitting patiently on the examination platform. He had tilted his head back slightly and appeared to be reading something on his personal device, one foot swinging idly. He looked, by any reasonable measure, like a person waiting contentedly for delayed transit connection. Utterly ordinary, completely harmless. The scanner, still running its analysis in the background, emitted another soft beep. It sounded, somehow, apologetic. "Get the commander," Venthara said again. I need full authorization for a deep evolutionary history analysis, and I need every senior officer on this station to understand what we may be dealing with." She turned to look back through the window. Marcus had apparently noticed us watching. He gave a small, cheerful wave. "That's not the wave of a predator," I said, grasping at whatever comfort I could find. "No," Venthara agreed. "It's worse. It's the wave of something that knows how not to seem like one." She finally looked away from the window. "Move, Krell, quickly." I moved. As I walked the long corridor toward the communications terminal, I turned the problem over and over in my mind like a stone that refused to reveal its hidden face. How did you send a message to your commanding officer explaining that the friendly, polite human being in your medical bay, the one who waved at you and said thank you and was training for a marathon, might be the most biologically improbable and potentially significant entity on the station, and that he didn't know it, and that he might never need to? Behind me, faintly through the sealed door, I heard Marcus begin to whistle, a light, wandering melody, cheerful and completely unassuming. The scanner's display flickered one final, defeated time before going dark, as though the device had examined all available data, run every possible analytical framework, and arrived at the conclusion that some problems exceeded its operational parameters. I began typing the message to Commander Plex, my manipulators trembling with a frequency I couldn't quite suppress. "Classification error. Please consult supervisor." Commander Plex arrived with an entourage more appropriate for a full diplomatic summit than a routine medical screening. Security Chief Drax, all 3 meters of him, armored in Crowlex composite plating that had absorbed actual weapons fire on 2 separate occasions, positioned himself outside the medical bay with 2 additional guards, all of them projecting the specific kind of alert stillness that experienced soldiers use to communicate that they are taking something seriously without wanting to cause panic. Dr. Yenna Ferris, the station's chief xenopsychologist, arrived clutching her analysis pad the way a scholar grips a rare manuscript they're afraid might dissolve. Ambassador Trilix from the diplomatic corps trailed behind everyone, looking thoroughly confused and visibly aggrieved about having been pulled from active trade negotiations. "This had better be worth abandoning the Centauri delegation mid-session," Commander Plex said, his sensory stalks twitching with barely contained irritation. "Your message said Category 5 biological anomaly. Do you have any concept of what that classification is intended to mean, Dr. Venthara?" Venthara simply gestured toward the medical bay's observation window. "See for yourself, Commander." Plex extended his sensory stalks toward the transparent aluminum and peered through. Marcus had, apparently, fallen asleep on the examination platform while we were all out here in the corridor having our quiet crisis. His chest rose and fell in a slow, deep rhythm. The medical monitors tracked his vital signs with their usual obsessive precision. "I see a human taking a nap," Plex said flatly. "An unusual choice during a medical examination, I'll grant you, but I don't see what requires." "He's not napping," Venthara said. "Watch the vitals." We crowded around the external monitoring panel. Marcus's heart rate had settled at 38 beats per cycle, a full 10 points lower than his already impressive waking measurement. Respiratory rate had decreased in precise proportion. His brainwave patterns showed the theta rhythms of light sleep, efficient and restorative. But his muscular system told a different story. Every major muscle group remained in a state of partial tension. Not the relaxed stillness of genuine deep sleep, but something more deliberate, a readiness coil beneath the surface, like a spring that was resting but hadn't been disengaged. Security Chief Drax made a low sound deep in his secondary vocal cords, the subsonic harmonic vibrating through the floor plating. "That's a predator's rest state," he said. "The musculature stays primed for instant activation. Prey species physiologically can't sleep like that. They require complete muscular relaxation to achieve full restoration. They are vulnerable when they sleep, so they have to commit to it fully." He paused, his eyes never leaving the figure on the platform. "Whatever that human is doing, it isn't what we would call sleep. And yet look at his cortisol levels," Venthara said, tapping the stress hormone readout. "Baseline, not elevated by a single measurable unit. He is completely, genuinely relaxed in an unfamiliar environment, surrounded by multiple alien species, confined in a medical facility he has never visited before. Prey psychology demands constant hypervigilance in precisely this type of scenario." Predator psychology demands territorial assessment and threat mapping. Is performing neither. She gestured at the peaceful figure on the platform. Is resting efficiently, because he has no reason not to. Dr. Ferris moved closer to the display, her optical sensors cycling through several focal adjustments as she absorbed the data. Venthara transferred the complete genetic analysis to Ferris's pad. We waited. The xenopsychologist was a deliberate reader. She went through the data in silence, her facial chromatophores cycling through colors I recognized as professional discomfort, then disbelief, then something that settled into the resigned shade of reluctant professional acceptance. When she finally set her pad down on the console beside her, she placed it with the exaggerated care of someone handling something they've realized is more fragile than it appeared. Human beings, Dr. Ferris said, should not exist. I mean that in the most precise scientific sense. The psychological profile contradicts the physiological data, which contradicts the evolutionary history, which contradict the behavioral patterns we observe in the field. She pulled up a comparative display, layering human biological data against a galactic standard taxonomic model. They have forward-facing predator eyes optimized for depth perception and target tracking. They have the cardiovascular and thermoregulatory adaptations of a persistence hunter capable of sustained aerobic exertion in high-heat environments. They have the cooperative social structures of a pack species. They have the adaptive tool use intelligence we associate almost exclusively with ecological scavengers. She paused to let that accumulate. But their threat response neurochemistry is built like a prey species. The adrenaline response enhances their physical strength and speed by 30 to 40% when they perceive immediate danger. Prey animals don't get stronger when threatened, Ambassador Trillick said, his translator working slightly harder than usual with the concept. They freeze or they flee. Humans do both, Ferris confirmed. They freeze first, sometimes for a fraction of a second, sometimes longer, to assess. Then they act, and what they do next depends entirely on their situational calculation. They might flee at exceptional speed. They might engage with violence amplified by neurochemical enhancement. They might attempt to negotiate. They might do something no existing behavioral model would have predicted. She highlighted a section of the analysis. Their decision-making matrix doesn't operate from instinctive defaults. It draws from a behavioral library that includes predator tactics, prey tactics, scavenger tactics, and several response categories that we don't have proper names for yet because no other species in our database has ever employed them. The room had grown very quiet. Even the air recycler seemed to have reduced its ambient noise out of courtesy. They also, Ferris added, pulling up a specific neural architecture diagram, have dedicated, specialized processing centers in their brain for calculating the ballistic trajectories of thrown objects. Entire regions of neural architecture devoted exclusively to projectile mechanics, the physics of throwing things at targets with precision. She let that settle. Do you understand how extraordinary that is? Their brains evolved a specific computational module for hunting at a distance before they ever developed mechanical range weapons. They were doing complex ballistic calculus with biological neural tissue. Security Chief Drax spoke then, his voice carrying the particular quality of a very large, very experienced warrior choosing his words with unusual care. On my home world, he said, we have old stories. Not history, older than history. Oral traditions from before we achieved interstellar travel, passed down through so many generations that the names and places have worn smooth and disappeared, leaving only the shape of the Fae. He was still watching Marcus through the observation window. Stories about creatures our ancestors called the Death Runners. Predators that didn't pursue with explosive speed. They didn't ambush. They didn't use superior size or strength or venom. They just followed. You ran. They jogged. You hid. They tracked. You fought. They backed away and waited at a distance, just beyond reach, and then they followed again. He paused. They followed until you had nothing left. Until the heat and the exhaustion and the despair combined to simply stop you in place. And then they killed you, not because they were faster, because they were more willing to keep going. The medical bay had developed a cold quality that the environmental systems couldn't explain. Earth had multiple species that used persistence hunting as their primary strategy, Venthara confirmed quietly, pulling up the supporting ecological data without looking away from a window. Wolves? African wild dogs, and humans. Humans most effectively of all. They can sustain running speeds or hours in temperature conditions that would incapacitate or kill most pursuit predators. They can track prey across terrain that leaves no obvious trail, reading signs so subtle that no artificial scanner would register them as significant. They can coordinate complex, adaptive, real-time hunts through communication systems that restructure themselves mid-pursuit to account for changing environmental conditions. She closed the file. They did all of this before the invention of agriculture, before projectile weapons of any mechanical sophistication. They ran animals to death across open savannas beneath a sun that, by all ecological logic, should have killed the hunters before it killed the hunted. On the examination platform, Marcus stirred. He rolled from his back to his side in a movement so smooth and controlled that it didn't register as unconscious behavior. Even in sleep, or whatever that state had been, his body moved with a considered efficiency of a system that had been optimized over an enormous span of time for one specific purpose: survival. Commander Plex's sensory stalks drooped into a configuration I had never seen from him before. A configuration that communicated, with unusual clarity, the experience of a supremely competent administrator confronting the realization that his world is larger and stranger than his models accounted for. "So," he said, his voice carefully neutral in the way that experienced commanders deploy when they are working very hard not to convey how they actually feel. "We have a species of persistence predators with a neurological architecture of prey animals, the cooperative instinct of a pack species, and the adaptive intelligence of ecological scavengers." He let a beat of silence pass. "And they've been living on our stations, working in our facilities, and integrating into galactic society for 6 years. And we're only having this conversation now." "They are extraordinarily good at seeming harmless," Dr. Ferris said. "And I want to be precise about something, because this distinction matters enormously. It isn't deception. Humans are genuinely cooperative. They form social attachments with remarkable ease and depth. They communicate with unusual openness. They prefer peaceful resolutions to conflict with a consistency that our behavioral models would associate with fundamentally non-aggressive species." She pulled up the psychological profile summary. "But that preference isn't rooted in an absence of capability. It's rooted in a calculation. As a species, across a span of many thousands of years, humans collectively evaluated their options and determined that cooperation produced better long-term outcomes than dominance. They chose civilization, with full awareness, at some deep evolutionary and cultural level, of what the alternative looked like. And they could choose differently," Drax said. He didn't phrase it as a question. "Theoretically. But the psychological data suggests strong countervailing forces. Human empathy responses and social bonding mechanisms are extremely powerful, arguably the strongest we've documented in any species with equivalent physical capability. When they classify an individual as part of their social group, their protective instincts activate with exceptional intensity. They'll defend members of that group with the same physiological enhancement they use for personal self-preservation." Ferris set down her pad. "And they extend that in-group classification very broadly, across biological boundaries, across cultural ones. Given sufficient time and positive interaction, they'll extend it to us." Ambassador Trilix, who had been listening with growing attention and diminishing bewilderment, spoke carefully. "I work alongside humans daily. Marcus himself serves as cultural liaison for the human contingent aboard the station. He is helpful and curious, and takes genuine pleasure in learning about other species. Are you suggesting that a sophisticated evolutionary strategy to lower our guard?" "No," Ferris said, with a firmness that closed the question. "I'm saying it's genuine. That's precisely what makes a complete picture so difficult to hold in your mind at one time. Both things are completely, measurably true. Humans genuinely want to cooperate. They genuinely prefer peaceful outcomes. They genuinely find other species interesting rather than threatening. And simultaneously, they are carrying biological and neurological architecture that evolution built specifically for a world that was actively trying to kill them at every moment." She looked through the window. "The kindness isn't a mask, but it isn't the whole picture, either." On the other side of the observation glass, Marcus's eyes opened, not with the slow, reluctant surfacing of most species emerging from sleep, the gradual brightening, the disorientation, the time required to rebuild a working model of the surrounding environment. His eyes simply opened, and he was immediately completely present, alert with a totality that had no equivalent in our taxonomic vocabulary. He sat up, looked around the medical bay with calm, unhurried attention, checked the time on his personal device, and stretched his arms over his head with the ease of someone doing something pleasant. "Should I knock?" he called toward the observation window, his voice carrying comfortable warmth through the audio system. "It's been about 40 minutes. Figured you'd come get me when you were ready. No rush." Venthara activated the communication panel. "Yes, Mr. Webb. Thank you for your patience. We'll be right in." She closed the channel and turned to face Commander Plex in the silence that followed. "So, what do we do?" The commander's sensory stalks coiled and uncoiled through several configurations of deep uncertainty before arriving, reluctantly, at something that resembled resolution. "What are our options?" he asked. "We could treat this as a security concern," Drax offered. His tone made clear he wasn't enthusiastic about the sound of his own suggestion. "Increase monitoring of human personnel. Implement additional safety protocols, Phil." "Based on what?" Ambassador Trilix interrupted. "They haven't violated any protocol. In 6 years of galactic community membership, there has not been a single documented incident of human aggression toward another species. No territorial disputes. No predatory behavior. No escalating conflicts." He folded his hands. "What would you tell them? That we decided they are dangerous because of what they could do? We could say that about anyone." "What I'd tell them," Drax said quietly, meeting the ambassador's gaze, "is nothing. Not yet, because the data isn't a threat assessment. It's a classification update." Dr. Ferris nodded slowly. "What we do is this. We update our models. We acknowledge that the categories we built our protocols around were incomplete. Not wrong about the species we built them for, but insufficient for a species we hadn't encountered yet. Humans don't fit our framework. That's not their problem. It's our framework's limitation. And we don't panic," she added, looking at each person in turn. "Because here's what else the complete data shows, with equal clarity. Human violence is almost exclusively defensive or protective in character. Yes, they are capable of extreme physical aggression. Yes, that aggression is neurochemically enhanced in moments of genuine threat. But the behavioral history shows that the threshold for triggering that response in a stable and positive social environment is very high. They are capable of enormous damage, and they appear to want, with equal intensity, never to cause it." Her voice softened slightly. "They cry at sad stories told by strangers. They make art about loss and love and the difficulty of being alive. They travel enormous distances to be present with people they care about during moments of pain. They are people, Commander, the most complicated, contradictory, occasionally deeply alarming people any of us are likely to encounter, but people." Drax was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his secondary vocal cords were entirely still, leaving only the primary voice, something I had learned he reserved for statements he intended to last. "My home world is a saying," he said. "The most dangerous warrior is one who prefers peace, because they understand, with complete clarity, what the alternative actually costs." Commander Plex's stalks finally settled into the configuration of decision. "Here's what we do. Dr. Venthara, you complete the medical screening according to standard protocols. Mr. Webb leaves that room with a clean bill of health and no indication that anything unusual occurred. Ambassador Trilix, you prepare a brief for the council. Honest, measured, no inflammatory language, but clear about the need for updated classification protocols and interaction guidelines. Dr. Ferris, you begin drafting those guidelines. Chief Drax, no changes to security protocols unless Dr. Ferris recommends them through proper channels, and I want her full analysis before any recommendation is made." He paused. "And everyone in this corridor keeps this discussion contained until we have a coherent plan. The last thing this station needs is a panic about the humans we've been having dinner with for 6 years." Venthara straightened her medical coat, drew herself to full height, and walked back into the examination room. "Mr. Webb, I'm so sorry for the delay. We had to run a few additional cross-references, standard procedure for arrival from certain planetary classifications." "No trouble at all." Marcus hopped down from the examination platform, landing from a height that would have created measurable skeletal stress in most species, his body absorbing it without apparent effort. Everything check out okay. You're in excellent health. Venthara allowed herself a small, genuine smile. Your cardiovascular system is particularly impressive. Thanks. I try to stay active. He glanced toward the observation window, where, though he couldn't know it, 5 senior station officers were watching him with a mixture of professional assessment and something that had no clean name in any language I knew. So I'm cleared for duty. Absolutely. Welcome to Station Kepler 7, Mr. Webb. They shook hands, a human greeting ritual that Venthara had learned during her first week of working alongside the human contingent. I watched it happen through the observation window, and I also watched the medical scanner, still running its final analysis in the background, display Marcus's grip strength in the readout, sufficient to crush most standard biological materials, currently calibrated to apply precisely the pressure appropriate for a friendly greeting, a predator's reflexes, a prey animal's awareness, pack coordination intelligence, scavenger tier adaptive creativity, all of it assembled across millions of years of impossible pressure on a world that had tried relentlessly to kill everything that lived on it. And the thing that world had produced, in the end, was something that chose to be kind. Marcus left the medical bay with a warm smile and a cheerful wave to everyone in sight. Ambassador Trilix fell naturally into step beside him, and within seconds they were deep in conversation about the upcoming cultural exchange program, walking down the corridor like 2 colleagues who had known each other for years. We watched them go. You know what the genuinely frightening part is? I said, to no one in particular, still watching the 2 figures recede down the corridor. Venthara turned to look at me. In 6 years, I said, humans have integrated so completely into galactic society that we stopped being curious about them. We accepted them, and they made that acceptance feel natural. They made it feel obvious. I lowered my datapad. That's not a biological adaptation. That's not evolutionary instinct. That's deliberate, conscious, sophisticated intelligence applied to the problem of belonging. They understood, somehow, how to fit in, how to make us comfortable, how to make us feel like they'd always been here. I paused, and they did it so well that we stopped asking questions. We just included them, and they let us think it had happened by accident. That's not frightening, Dr. Ferris said softly, beside me. I know it sounds like it should be, but it isn't. She was still watching Marcus and Trilix, their figures growing smaller in the distance. They could have done something else with that intelligence. Every advantage they carry could have been leveraged differently, to intimidate, to dominate, to occupy territory in the galactic community by force of simple capability. They had every tool for it. Her voice was thoughtful, almost wondering. Instead, they chose to learn our languages. They learned our customs and our courtesies. They learned which gestures mean what to which species, and they deployed that knowledge in the service of making other people comfortable, not as manipulation, as care. She finally looked away from the corridor. Yes, humans are dangerous. The data is unambiguous about that. But they are also, in ways that our classification systems are genuinely not built to measure, profoundly kind. And they chose that kindness, deliberately, consciously, with full awareness of the alternative. She paused. That's not something to fear. That's something to be grateful for. Commander Plex's sensory stalks drooped into a configuration that communicated either deep philosophical agreement or the exhaustion of a man who had been awake too long and learned too much in a single afternoon. I need a drink, he said. A substantial one. 2, said Drax, with feeling. I'll join you both, said the ambassador. They walked away together down the corridor, 3 senior officers processing the afternoon's discoveries in the time-honored fashion of people who need to be somewhere quiet with something strong. Venthara and I remained behind in the medical bay entrance, watching the scanner reset itself for the next patient, its display clearing and restarting with cheerful, professional indifference to everything it had just attempted to classify. You know, Venthara said eventually, her voice carrying particular quality of someone speaking a thought aloud for the first time, testing whether it holds together when it enters the air. I have spent 2 centuries studying this field. I built my entire professional framework on the certainty that if you gathered enough data, applied the right analytical models, and asked the right questions, you could understand any living thing the universe produced. Categorize it, map its boundaries, know what it was. She was quiet for a moment. I was correct about the data and the models and the questions. I was wrong about the conclusion. Some things exceed the categories we build to contain them. A slow ripple moved across her dorsal spines, not stress this time, but something more complex, something I didn't have a word for yet. Earth didn't just produce a species. It produced survivors. The kind of survivors who look at a galaxy full of creatures that evolved on gentler worlds, with kinder conditions, and feel not resentment but curiosity. Who respond to difference not with territorial aggression, but with a handshake and a smile and genuine questions about your culture. She paused once more. That's not an evolutionary accident. That's a choice they made so long ago and so completely that it has become what they are. The scanner beeped softly, ready, patient, moving on. Somewhere on station Kepler 7, Marcus Webb was settling into his new quarters. He was probably unpacking the personal items he carried across the transit route, arranging them in the way that people do when they are claiming a space, making it their own. He was probably already composing a message to Jenny about the station's layout, or making plans to have dinner with Ambassador Trilix and whoever else from the human contingent wanted to get together. Just another evening. Just another friendly, curious, thoroughly cooperative colleague, making himself at home. The most complex biological entity ever catalogued by the Galactic Assessment Bureau, humming quietly to himself in a room 200 meters away, completely unaware that 5 senior officers had spent the better part of an afternoon trying to figure out how to categorize his existence. I headed back to my own quarters, already composing my personal log entry. How did you summarize a day like this one? How did you explain the discovery that your neighbor, the one who remembered your name and asked about your research and always said good morning, was something the universe had apparently never quite built before? How did you convey the specific texture of learning that the thing you had every reason to fear had looked at that fear and chosen, quite deliberately, to be kind instead? Maybe you didn't explain it. Maybe explanation was the wrong tool for the job. Maybe what it asked for was something simpler and more difficult. Acceptance. The way humans had accepted us, not because we were easy to understand, not because our classifications made intuitive sense to them, but because they had decided we were worth knowing. Maybe that was what the scanner's failed classification was really telling us. Not that humans were undefinable, not that they were dangerous, not even that they were magnificent, though I was beginning to believe they were. Maybe it was simply telling us that some things are too alive to be contained in a category. The corridor was quiet around me, the station doing what stations do in the late shift, humming and cycling and maintaining the condition for life to continue. Somewhere in it, hybrid shadows cast by the crossing of light from 1,000 different worlds, Marcus Webb existed. Impossible, contradictory, genuinely, inconveniently, beautifully real. And out there, impossibly distant and impossibly present, Earth continued turning, heavy with its own gravity, bright with its dangerous oxygen, wild with its weather and its megafauna and its deep, scarred, magnificent history of producing things that refuse to stop. The most dangerous world in the catalogue, the most hopeful species it had ever made. I closed my log and let the quiet settle around me, and I thought that the universe, it turned out, was considerably larger than our classifications could hold, and humans were the proof. The medical scanner beeped 3 times, paused as though gathering its thoughts, then beeped 7 more times in what could only be described as mechanical bewilderment. Dr. Venthara pressed her primary manipulator flat against the display screen, her secondary eyes narrowing to thin, calculating slits. "Run it again," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone, the one that meant someone, somewhere, had made a catastrophic mistake, and she was mere moments away from discovering exactly who. I stood behind her, clutching my datapad against my chest like it might somehow shield me from whatever catastrophe was unfolding. As the most junior xenobiologist aboard orbital station Kepler 7, my responsibilities typically involved cataloging microbial samples from passing cargo ships and updating atmospheric composition reports. Quiet work, predictable work. Whatever this was turning into, it was neither. The scanner ran its analysis again. Same result. The holographic display above the examination platform flickered and stuttered, projecting a double helix that seemed to argue with itself about fundamental categories, a strand of genetic code that couldn't decide what it was, like a sentence written in two different languages simultaneously, neither quite making sense. Impossible, Venthara muttered. Coming from someone with 4 doctoral degrees and 2 full centuries of xenobiological fieldwork, that single word landed in the room like a dropped stone into still water. The subject of a bewilderment, one Marcus Webb, listed on his arrival manifest as a cultural liaison and newly assigned civilian specialist, sat on the examination platform with an expression of patient, mild-mannered curiosity. He wore the standard-issue civilian jumpsuit distributed to all new arrivals, its gray fabric slightly wrinkled from his long transit journey. He'd been remarkably polite throughout the entire mandatory medical screening process. Cheerfully cooperative, in fact. Too cheerfully cooperative. Perhaps, in my limited experience, apex predators didn't say please and thank you with quite that much apparent sincerity. Is everything all right? Marcus asked, tilting his head slightly to one side. According to my xenopsychology training, that particular gesture indicated curiosity without aggression, a submissive, open posture. Harmless, friendly, even approachable. The scanner beeped again. This time, I was almost certain the tone carried an edge of warning. Venthara's dorsal spines rippled in a slow, involuntary wave, the RE physiological response to acute stress, as automatic and uncontrollable as a heartbeat. She straightened herself, visibly composing her expression before turning to face the human on the platform. "Mr. Webb," she said, her voice measured and professional, "I need to ask you some questions. For scientific purposes. You understand?" "Sure thing. Document." He smiled. It was a warm, entirely pleasant smile. But the scanner, ever thorough, chose that precise moment to highlight his dental anatomy in pulsing, alarmed red on its display. Flat incisors at the front, consistent with an omnivorous plant processing diet. And behind them, canines, sharp ones. The overlapping classification sat side by side in the readout like two contradictory testimonies in a court case, each perfectly valid, each undermining the other. "Your species," Venthara began carefully, pulling up the pre-screening planetary data, "evolve on a world classified as what exactly, in your own estimation?" Marcus scratched the side of his jaw with 2 fingers, another supposedly non-threatening gesture that, inexplicably, made every dormant survival instinct in my body suddenly sit up and pay acute attention. "Earth," he said simply. "It's a Class M world, right? Pretty standard from what I've read in the galactic catalogs. A little heavy on the gravity side. Maybe. Why? Is something wrong with my blood work?" Venthara pulled up the planetary assessment report that had been filed 6 years ago during humanity's initial contact with the galactic community. Her tertiary eyes, the small pair she used primarily for close detail work, widened fractionally as she began to read the raw data beneath the summary classification. "Heavy on the gravity side." She repeated his phrase with a particular flatness of someone discovering that their house had been built on a fault line. "Your world has 1.3 times the galactic standard gravity. Your atmosphere contains 21% free oxygen, nearly double the concentration found on most habitable worlds. Your temperature variation between seasons reaches 70 degrees. Your weather systems generate sustained wind velocities exceeding 200 kilometers per hour." She paused, scrolling further. "Your predator-to-prey ratio in numerous biomes is." She stopped, read the figure again in silence, then a third time. "What does it say?" I asked immediately and instantly regretted opening my mouth. "It says," Venthara replied very quietly, "that there are multiple regions on Earth where the predator population exceeds the prey population." She set down the datapad with deliberate care. Megafauna that hunt in coordinated packs. Solitary ambush hunters with bite forces exceeding industrial hydraulic equipment. Aquatic predators of exceptional size occupying every depth range. And somehow, amidst all of this, humans became the dominant species. Marcus lifted one shoulder in a casual, 2-joint shrug that somehow managed to project absolute serenity. "Yeah, we had to get creative about it. Teamwork, mostly. Tools, communication, that sort of thing." The scanner, apparently deciding that the dental architecture hadn't caused sufficient alarm, began presenting new information. This time it was delivering a cardiovascular analysis, and I watched the numbers populate the display with a growing sensation that my own circulatory system was considering an emergency shutdown in solidarity. "Your heart rate," Venthara said, her voice dropping to something approaching reverence, "is currently 48 beats per cycle." "Yeah, that's about right." Marcus glanced down at himself as though double-checking. "Actually a touch slow, even for me. I've been training for a marathon, so my resting rate has dropped a bit over the past few months." A pause settled over the medical bay like sediment drifting to the bottom of still water. "Training," Venthara said, "for a marathon. That's a long-distance running event, correct?" I managed, proud of myself for contributing something.